50 sea otters are floating in the kelp off the Big Sur coastline. The year's 1938, a biologist scans the fog-shrouded cliffs from a small plane, expecting nothing. Sea otters are considered functionally extinct in the contiguous United States. The fur trade had seen to that, but there they are, bobbing in the cold Pacific swells, wrapped in kelp like they never left. At least that's what everyone thought. This wasn't a rescue mission. It became the most consequential marine discovery of the century. How does someone go from a thriving population of 300,000 animals to the edge of total biological erasure? The fur trade did it in less than a century. Starting in the mid-1700s, Russian, British, and American hunters moved systematically down the Pacific coast, targeting sea otters for their pelts. And those pelts were extraordinary. Dense, luxurious, waterproof sea otter fur was among the most valuable commodities on Earth at the time. A single pelt could fetch the equivalent of months of wages. Entire fleets were organized around harvesting them. By the early 1900s, the numbers told a devastating story. A population once estimated at somewhere between 150,000 and 300,000 animals had been reduced to the low hundreds, scattered, isolated, and functionally invisible across most of their historic range. Partially extinct meant there weren't enough left to make hunting profitable. Biologically extinct meant there weren't enough left to sustain a population. For the sea otter, both descriptions applied to nearly every stretch of coastline from Alaska to Baja California. In 1911, the International Treaty offered the first legal protection, a landmark agreement between the United States, Russia, Great Britain, and Japan that prohibited open water hunting of fur seals and sea otters. And no, I'm not making that up. A multinational treaty to save a marine mammal was negotiated over a century ago, and most people have never heard of it. It slowed the killing, but it couldn't undo what had already been done. The California coast went quiet in a way that wasn't just about the absence of otters. Kelp forests that had thrived for millennia began to deteriorate. Sea urchin populations, no longer controlled by a top predator, expanded unchecked across the sea floor. The underwater landscape began to restructure itself around the absence of a single species. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was a symptom. And then the fur trade made the one decision that changed everything. It didn't stop until there was almost nothing left to take. That momentum of total extraction pushed the sea otter so close to zero that the margin between survival and disappearance became almost theoretical. One biologist saw it coming. Carol Heath had documented otter behavior along the California coast in the early 1900s and warned that the population trajectory was catastrophic. Nobody listened. If the sea otter had disappeared entirely from the California coast, this would be a very different story, not just for the species, but for every kelp forest, every fish nursery, and every coastal ecosystem that depended on a balance nobody fully understood yet. The Big Sur coastline is not a place that forgives casual visitors. In the mid-20th century, before Highway 1 was fully accessible and before the cliffs had been mapped in any useful detail, this stretch of the central California coast was essentially a fortress of geography. Sheer rock faces dropped hundreds of feet into churning surf. No trails, no docks. The land itself was a barrier, and that barrier, entirely by accident, became the last line of defense for a species that had been hunted to the edge of oblivion everywhere else. The isolation was not a conservation strategy. Nobody planned it. No government agency designated Big Sur as a refuge. No treaty covered this particular cove or that particular kelp bed. The otters survived here simply because the hunters couldn't reach them. The same terrain that made the coastline spectacular made it inaccessible. And inaccessibility, in the brutal calculus of the fur trade, meant survival. The hunters went where the going was easy. Big Sur was never easy. When the survey aircraft passed over in 1938 and the biologist aboard counted approximately 50 individual animals floating in the kelp canopy, the number was simultaneously a miracle and a crisis. A miracle because the species was supposed to be gone from this coastline entirely. A crisis because 50 individuals is not a population in any robust biological sense. It is a remnant. It is a statistical whisper. Conservation biology has long grappled with the concept of minimum viable population, the smallest number of individuals in a wild species at which the population has a specified probability of surviving for a defined period of time. 50 animals sits so far below that range that the statistical models would have given the Big Sur colony very poor odds indeed. The genetic dimension made things worse. When a population is compressed into a small number of individuals over multiple generations, the genetic diversity of that group narrows dramatically. Harmful recessive traits become more likely to express. Scientists call this a genetic bottleneck, and the Big Sur otters had passed through one of the most severe bottlenecks imaginable. Every otter alive in California at that moment was descended from the same tiny founding group, carrying the same compressed genetic legacy of a species that had once ranged across the entire North Pacific Rim. The scientists who confirmed the discovery in 1938 faced a dilemma that had no clean answer. Announce the colony publicly, and you risk alerting poachers who might see the remaining animals as a final, accessible harvest. The fur trade had not been abolished in any absolute sense. Enforcement was thin, penalties were light, and the coastline was remote enough that illegal hunting would be difficult to detect or prevent. Keep the discovery quiet, and you protect the animals in the short term, but you also delay the legal protections and the scientific attention that a confirmed surviving population would trigger. The decision to handle the discovery carefully, releasing information slowly, working through official channels, avoiding the kind of press coverage that would put a precise location in the public domain, reflected a hard-won understanding of how quickly human attention can become human pressure. The scientists weren't being secretive out of professional jealousy. They were being cautious because they understood what was at stake. 50 animals, one coastline, no margin for error. What happened next would take decades to fully unfold. The colony survived, it held, and from that improbable nucleus of 50 animals clinging to an inaccessible stretch of fog-shrouded cliffs, something extraordinary began to grow. Picture an underwater forest, not a metaphor, a literal forest, with canopy and understory and floor, with light filtering down through fronds 60 feet tall, with fish moving through the structure like birds through a woodland canopy. Kelp forests along the California coast are among the most biologically productive ecosystems on the planet. They are ancient, complex, and fragile in ways that aren't immediately obvious. And the single most important factor in whether a kelp forest exists at all is whether or not a 25-pound marine mammal is eating urchins nearby. Sea otters are what ecologists call a keystone species. The term comes from the architecture of a stone arch. The keystone is the central wedge at the top that holds the entire structure together. Remove it and the arch collapses, one whose impact on its environment is disproportionately large relative to its abundance. Sea otters don't dominate the California coast by sheer numbers. They shape it by what they eat. The mechanism is direct and ruthless. Sea urchins graze on kelp. Specifically, they target the holdfasts, the root-like structures at the base of kelp stipes that anchor the plant to the rocky sea floor. When urchin populations are controlled, they graze moderately and the kelp forest maintains itself. When urchin populations explode, they systematically destroy kelp from the bottom up, severing the holdfasts until entire forests of giant kelp simply detach and drift away. No fish, no invertebrates worth counting. No structure, just urchins waiting for kelp that will never grow back as long as they remain. Research conducted along the California coast and in Alaska's Aleutian Islands has documented this transition with striking precision. In areas where otters were removed or absent, urchin densities increased by factors of 10 to 20 times baseline levels within a few years. Kelp canopy cover dropped from 80 or 90% to near zero in the same time frame. Transition from forest to barren was not gradual. It was a regime shift, a rapid, non-linear collapse from one stable state to a completely different one. And that wasn't even the part that got people angry. The part that genuinely unsettled the scientific community was how stable the urchin barren state turned out to be. Once a kelp forest collapsed into a barren, it didn't naturally recover even if some of the stressors were removed. The urchins persisted. They could survive in a near starvation state for years, grazing on encrusting algae and detritus, waiting. The barren was self-reinforcing. Getting back to a kelp forest required active intervention, or otters. With otters present, the dynamic reversed completely. A single adult sea otter consumes roughly 25% of its body weight in food every day, approximately 11 to 12 pounds of prey. Sea urchins are a preferred prey item, calorie-dense and relatively easy to catch. An otter population of even modest size can suppress urchin densities across a substantial area of sea floor, shifting the balance back toward kelp growth. Studies in Monterey Bay documented kelp canopy recovery beginning within 2 to 3 years of otter recolonization in previously barren zones. The downstream effects of that recovery compound rapidly. Kelp forests support an estimated 800 or more species along the California coast. They function as nursery habitat for commercially important fish species including rockfish, lingcod, and several species of surf perch. They shelter invertebrates, abalone, sea stars, crabs, and dozens of others in a three-dimensional habitat structure that flat seafloor simply cannot replicate. And they sequester carbon at rates that researchers have compared favorably to terrestrial forests, absorbing CO2 through photosynthesis and transporting organic carbon to the seafloor when fronds sink and decompose. The urchin barren was a warning sign. The ecosystem had ignored it for decades before the otters came back. But the barren's existence made the recovery, when it finally came, all the more measurable and all the more remarkable. For most of American legal history, a wild animal had no standing. It could be hunted, trapped, or driven to extinction, and the law had relatively little to say about it. Sea otter survival through the mid-20th century was essentially a geographic accident. The Big Sur colony persisted because of terrain, not because of legal protection. Most people never heard about this part. The window between the colony's discovery in 1938 and the passage of meaningful federal law stretched for more than 3 decades, during which the otters recovered slowly and without any formal guarantee of safety. That changed in 1972. The Marine Mammal Protection Act was a sweeping piece of federal legislation that prohibited the taking, harassment, hunting, capture, or killing of marine mammals in U.S. waters. The law applied to all marine mammals, whales, dolphins, seals, sea lions, and otters, regardless of their population status. For the sea otter, it meant that the legal ambiguity of the previous 60 years was finally resolved. The animals were protected. Period. The Endangered Species Act of 1973 added another layer. The California sea otter was listed as a threatened species under the act, which triggered a set of mandatory federal obligations that went beyond simple protection. The U.S. designated critical habitat along the Central California coast established buffer zones where federal agencies were required to consult on any action that might harm the species or its habitat. The law didn't just protect the animals, it created an institutional obligation to actively recover them. The conflict with commercial fishing interests began almost immediately. Crab fishermen operating along the Central California coast reported that otters were competing directly with their traps, consuming Dungeness crab and other commercially valuable species. Abalone divers, a significant industry in California at the time, argued that otter predation on abalone was devastating stocks that had supported coastal communities for generations. Both groups were correct in their observations. Otters do eat crab. Otters do eat abalone. The conflict was real, not manufactured. What made the political tension particularly sharp was the recovery plan's population benchmarks. The plan established that the California sea otter population needed to reach and sustain 3,090 individuals before the species could be considered for delisting. That number wasn't arbitrary. It was derived from population viability analyses designed to ensure the colony had sufficient size and genetic diversity to withstand environmental shocks. But to fishing communities watching their harvests decline, a federal mandate to grow the otter population to over 3,000 animals felt less like science and more like a declaration of war. The sardonic reality of the situation was this: the same laws that made the recovery possible also made the conflict inevitable. You cannot grow a predator population inside a working fishery without someone losing something. The Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act didn't resolve that tension. They just forced it into a legal framework where science had to drive the decisions, not just the loudest voice in the room. The California sea otter had legal protection, a recovery mandate, and designated critical habitat. It had a clock had already started on reaching population benchmarks that would determine its long-term legal status. And the clock had already started. A sea otter mother floats on her back in Monterey Bay, a single pup balanced on her chest. The pup is weeks old, completely dependent, and will remain that way for the next 1.5 years. Sea otters do not produce litters. They do not breed seasonally in the way that allows for rapid population explosions. One pup per year, per female, is the biological ceiling, and that ceiling made the mathematics of recovery brutally slow. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the California sea otter population grew, but the growth was measured in single digits per year. The colony that had numbered approximately 50 animals in 1938 had reached around 400 by 1976, when the first formal population surveys under the Endangered Species Act framework began. That sounds like progress, and it was, but the rate of increase was fragile. A single bad year, a disease outbreak, a spike in bycatch mortality could erase years of accumulated growth. Bycatch emerged as the dominant human-caused threat during this period. Sea otters forage in the same nearshore zones where commercial fishermen set gill nets, trammel nets, and crab traps. An otter that enters a gill net does not have the lung capacity or the leverage to free itself. Drowning is vapid. Researchers estimating bycatch mortality during the 1970s and 1980s concluded that entanglement in fishing gear was responsible for a substantial fraction of annual otter deaths, suppressing population growth well below its biological potential. The animals were reproducing. The nets were keeping the population from climbing. Aquarium rescue and rehabilitation programs began filling a gap that wild survival rates alone couldn't close. The Monterey Bay Aquarium, which opened in 1984, became one of the most important institutions in California sea otter recovery. Surrogate mother otters, experienced wild females, were used to teach pups the skills they would need to survive. The program was painstaking, expensive, and essential. By the late 1990s, the California population had crossed the 2,000 animal threshold, from 50 individuals in 1938 to more than 2,000 by the end of the century, a 40-fold increase across 6 decades. The number sounds triumphant. In absolute terms, it was, but the recovery plan's benchmark of 3,090 animals remained out of reach, and the population's growth rate had begun to plateau in ways that puzzled and concerned researchers. Something was still suppressing the upper limit of recovery, and the answer, when it came, would point to threats that no law had yet fully addressed. Stand on the cliffs above Point Lobos on a clear morning and look down. The water is not blue, it is green-brown and thick with life, the surface interrupted by the amber fronds of giant kelp reaching up from below, and somewhere in the middle of it, a raft of otters floating in the canopy like they own the place. They do. Pay attention to this next detail because it explains everything about what happened to this coastline over the past 80 years. Before the otters came back, this water was different. Surveys conducted in the 1950s and 1960s documented extensive urchin barrens along the central California coast, flat, featureless zones of seafloor where kelp forests had once stood. The transition back to structured habitat didn't happen overnight. It happened incrementally, patch by patch, as the otter population expanded its range northward and southward from the Big Sur core. Each new stretch of coastline colonized by otters became, within a few years, a zone of urchin suppression and kelp recovery. Aerial surveys and underwater transect studies conducted by researchers at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and other institutions tracked this transformation with quantitative precision. In areas where otters had been present for more than 5 years, kelp canopy cover increased by an average of more than 60% compared to otter-free zones. Fish species richness inside recovering kelp forests was measurably higher. Studies documented increases of 30 to 50% in the number of fish species present in recolonized areas compared to adjacent barrens. The forest was coming back, and everything that lived in forests was coming back with it. The carbon story added a dimension that nobody had fully anticipated. Giant kelp is one of the fastest growing organisms on Earth. Under ideal conditions, it can grow 2 feet per day. When kelp fronds die and sink to the sea floor, they carry that sequestered carbon with them, effectively removing it from the active carbon cycle. The recovery of California's kelp forests, driven in significant part by otter predation on urchins, represented a measurable contribution to coastal carbon sequestration, a benefit that had never appeared in any cost-benefit analysis of the otter recovery. Specific rephrasing of the shocking detail in simpler terms. The otters weren't just saving the kelp, they were helping pull carbon out of the atmosphere. Coastal communities noticed changes that didn't require a research degree to observe. Fishermen working the central California coast reported clearer water in areas where kelp had recovered. Species that had been absent for decades, certain rockfish, lingcod, and vertebrates associated with complex habitat began reappearing in zones where otters had established themselves. The ocean looked different. It smelled different. It was different. The recovery of kelp canopy along the central California coast would come back to haunt the urchin-barren paradigm permanently. But that's getting ahead of the story. When a single species comes back from 50 individuals and rewrites the ecology of an entire coastline, the lesson isn't really about otters. It's about what ecosystems are capable of when you remove the pressure that was destroying them. The California sea otter population stands at approximately 3,000 individuals as of the most recent federal survey. 50 individuals is below every standard threshold for long-term survival. The Big Sur colony had no statistical right to exist. But it did. The genetic bottleneck was survived because the habitat pressure was removed and the legal framework eventually caught up. Keystone species recovery doesn't scale linearly. 50 animals produced an ecosystem transformation that touched hundreds of species and millions of acres of seafloor. The otter case is now taught in conservation biology programs on every continent. The lesson it carries is unambiguous. Protecting a remnant population is not a consolation prize. It is the entire game. Subscribe so you see the next story about a species that changed everything.